record. Perfect. We'll be sending a link to the recording afterwards, as well as the slides from both of the presenters, so you can send it to your favorite planner or planning board member and rewatch it again if there's anything you missed and flip through those slides. We're going to have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, so drop your questions in the Q&A box down at the bottom. I'm going to start by introducing today's moderator, Jody Nazaka, and turn the show over to her. So Jody is a senior planner with the City of Manchester in the Planning and Community Development Department. She's responsible for supporting the planned and managed development of the City of Manchester to ensure a healthy economic base, safe and livable neighborhoods, cultural opportunities, and quality public facilities. She currently oversees the master plan update, an 18-month-long process that will conclude with the community's fresh new vision for Manchester's future. Jody holds multiple certifications, including a certificate in creative placemaking from the Institute of Art and Design at New England College, and a certificate of leadership and management from the University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension. She has a BS in environmental planning from Plymouth State University and is currently pursuing an MPA public administration at Southern New Hampshire University. Jody has been an active member of the New Hampshire Planners Association, the Northern New England chapter of the APA, and Plan New Hampshire's Board of Directors. Jody also serves on the steering committee for Manchester Connects as the co-chair of placemaking. Jody, we're super happy to have you moderating today's conversation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for joining us. I'm going to turn my camera off while I turn it over to the speakers and introduce them. So it's great seeing you all. So just to start, as Sarah mentioned, we will hold all questions until the end. So if you could just pop those questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. Please put them in the Q&A box. And just as a refresher, for anyone that's not familiar with the missing middle is a term coined by Optico's design that refers to the whole spectrum of homes in between single-family homes and large apartment buildings. This includes duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, small-scale apartment buildings with a handful of units, cottage courts, townhouses, and so forth. The missing middle development used to be all over the place in our cities, built before the post-World War II suburban experiment. It offers a host of benefits that make for strong, resilient cities, and we're excited to be discussing that today. So I'll introduce our first speaker, George Proakis. As the Executive Director of the Office of Strategic Planning and Community Development in Somerville, Massachusetts, one of New England's fastest growing cities, George Proakis facilitates the implementation of the Summer Vision City Plan, with a focus on such varied topics as zoning, urban design, stormwater recharge, backyard chickens, family housing, dining decks, and dormers. Mr. Proakis and his team coordinate the development of the Somerville by Design neighborhood planning process, facilitate economic development and small business programs, manage substantial mobility and public space projects, coordinate an extensive inclusionary housing program, facilitate state and federal grants, manage a client service-based anti-displacement program, and work to implement Somerville's newly adopted form-based zoning code. Prior to working in Somerville, George worked in a number of roles for the Mill City of Lowell, Massachusetts, where he focused on downtown redevelopment, a citywide comprehensive master plan, a new zoning code for neighborhood infill projects, and the redevelopment of form-based code for the 15-acre transit-oriented Hamilton Canal District project. George is a founding board member of the New England chapter of the Congress for New Urbanism, a member of the board of directors of the Boston Society of Architects, and a member of the steering committee for the Form-Based Codes Institute at Smart Growth America, He has taught a course in economic development planning at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. Mr. Proakis holds a Master's of City Planning from MIT, a Master's of Public Administration from the Maxwell School at Syracuse, and a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Northeastern University. Impressive, to say the least, George. They're all yours.
All right, thank you. I'm going to do this screen share and PowerPoint thing. I'm hoping everybody can see that now. So I'm going to try to give a little perspective on missing middle housing, some of my experience from Somerville and Lowell, talk a bit about zoning and land use regulation and how it relates. I like to start conversations like this by reminding people and looking at the way that traditional New England cities and towns were formed and have created themselves, and sort of where we've kind of gone sort of astray from that original plan. You find it at different scales, more urban or more suburban. This is kind of, or more rural. This is more kind of a suburban middle. You get different levels of a commercial town center, the New England Town Hall with a little cupola on the roof. This is Portland, Maine, I believe, which is a little bit more intense level of a downtown. But as a part of that, you can often find that multifamily housing of different shapes and sizes was always a part of that traditional experience. Everything from duplexes to 16, 17 units. I mean, and they fit around and in and as a part of those community centers. Somewhere we kind of wandered away from that. We still have the New England cupola on the top of our buildings, but now they're strip malls with parking lots. We still end up with corner stores, but often they have 80-foot curb cuts. And on housing, we seem to have really gotten to the point where people talk a lot about multifamily and sort of imagining all of these different type of apartment types, or single family and imagining sort of single family houses on a cul-de-sac, kind of the most conventional type of development, the sort of subdivision development that we often get in many communities when we're adding housing in this day and age. And so when we try to break down housing types, a lot of people think of housing, they think of that single family, or they think of high rises, just towers. And sometimes those high rises take different shapes and forms, but oftentimes they are tall, intense multifamily buildings. I think in the most recent of times, and this building's in Somerville, it's something we helped permit, the stick-built housing above a concrete base, these sort of 5-over-1 building types have become a way to deliver multiple units of multifamily housing. And in many communities, they may fit well. And in many times you'll see these sort of at the fringes of a community and they'll fit well, or near a downtown and they'll fit well. But in many other cases, relative to the range of possibilities, they're too big. And relative to the range of possibilities, the single family subdivision is too small. So in between is a housing type that many communities have just lost the skill at how to do. The duplexes, the fourplexes, the cottage courts, townhouses, and things up to, 13, 14, 15 units. And then, the bigger ones, the production developers know how to do. The smaller ones, certainly the subdivision developers know how to do. And that's sort of what's led to Opticos Design's Missing Middle Housing conversation to the book, which is a really good book on this topic, by the way, and to sort of looking deeper into these particular housing types. I think in Somerville, what's interesting is we have focused on these quite a bit. Somerville is a very different character than a lot of other communities that I speak to. So I always say, you've got to take the Somerville example and sort of determine where and how it fits. Within the Summer Vision Comprehensive Plan, we have areas to conserve, enhance, and transform. But one of the things we've done that's pretty substantial is our conserve areas, the one with the least ability to build. You still have a 2-family house as a base and even a third with an accessory dwelling unit. Enhance, you can get a lot of those missing middle housing types. And the transform areas like Assembly Square in Somerville is where we're building a lot of that multifamily, multi-hundreds of units type of building that's sort of on the other extreme. But in Somerville, one of the things we focused on in recent years is how to take the traditional building type and make it reappear in new form in the community. So Somerville has a particular experience with triple deckers. This is a 3-family house, brand new construction. This is a 5-unit project that's actually looks more like sort of 2 triples put together. What I like about this is the back on the side street where the parking's kind of tucked underneath and behind, and it's a pretty subtle for this. This looks like it's been here 100 years. This is a 7-year-old building or so. Townhouse types that we've been able to do in a form that allows for a walkable streetscape and kind of connecting to the community town center. And then every now and then we just get these pieces where we have a piece of land where somebody wants to build infill, and it works in one of those enhanced zones. And this is next to a future transit station where you can get a small retail. In this case, you have an insurance office and 5 units. And it's only 3 stories. It's not particularly outrageous. It fits in well with what's around it. A couple of examples here from a corridor in Somerville where we had a lot of gas stations and kind of underutilized lots and repair shops that weren't doing well. And we did streetscape upgrades to make the street more walkable. And the development community has responded with, this is a 6-plex on the left, a 3-family on the right, not particularly really intense new housing, but it fills in that middle. This is another, which are, I think each is like 4 or 5 units. They managed to share a driveway in the back. The one on the left has a retail. I think it has a hair salon on the first floor. So there's possibilities. And then you can go up to a little bit more intense. This is an example that we've seen happen a number of times in our community. That building over there on the left is an old hall for a fraternal organization whose membership has been dropping, and they don't rent the hall as much anymore. And building 15 units or so with a space for them underneath allowed them to redevelop their land and still have a sustainable way to have their organization have some space. But the challenge, I think, in Missing Middle a lot of time comes when you are trying to fit Missing Middle into some of either these traditional neighborhoods or even more contemporary neighborhoods. People sort of have their streetscape of single family houses or even the cul-de-sac single family house, and someone tries to drop something into the middle of it that's multifamily, and you find that it didn't necessarily kind of fit the character of what was around it. Now, this is from my Lowell days. This is a duplex that was allowed in the two-family district that we allowed there. Didn't kind of really fit the context. This is a 4-unit setup, two families, that wasn't very well received in the community because it sort of looks like it landed like a spaceship from outer space, looking nothing like the community around it. And even townhouses, when you sort of disconnect townhouses from the town and surround them instead with pavement, it's something you can do. It provides housing. It provides multifamily housing. It also tends to bring out the NIMBYs and the cave people, the citizens against virtually everything, the people who don't want any development to happen at all. So we've tried to take these Missing Middle types and also make them contextual to the New England context. A two-family that is a duplex, fourplex. This is a project in Lowell we did where we did a 4-family with a front porch. Again, I don't think this wins any architectural design awards, but it fits its neighborhood a lot better than what's around it. And here's a way, rather than big pavement, to do 13 units with a first floor retail that fits on a streetscape with the neighborhood where the houses around it are all single families and two families, and it doesn't look that outrageously out of place when it's dropped into the middle of there. But the reality is that to get the quality Missing Middle, you often have to have the code to do it. So I want to spend the second half of my time talking today about my favorite topic, zoning. And particularly form-based codes and how they can help with this particular strategy of creating Missing Middle housing. Form-based codes focus more on form than on use and density, and you spend a lot more time thinking about form when you create the code. Typical codes spend all their time thinking about uses. And one of the challenges is that when you kind of lose the focus on housing, you've got your single family housing district over there, and that's housing. And then I got my business district. And I'm trying to figure out, well, what can I have in my business district? This is an actual use table from a code in California. It lists like 250 things you can have in a business district. And, people doing zoning spend all of their time doing this, talking about whether or not you can resell, sell a chinchilla, put in words here that are barely able to be defined, physical culture institution, whatever that means, potato chip manufacturing. But you can't manufacture a tortilla chip here unless you go back and redo your zoning code. These are the kind of things that we spend our time doing in zoning when we're not spending our time figuring out how to make contextual housing around it. This particular district, by the way, they really liked their Turkish baths. They listed them twice. But a form-based code can work primarily on defining place, on focusing on form instead of density, emphasizing mixes of uses, putting a greater attention to streetscape and what's around it, and putting public comment and participation up front, maybe getting people more comfortable that a two-family or a cottage court or a sixplex isn't a bad thing in our neighborhood if it's designed well, if we have conversations about how it might fit the neighborhood, if we do community visioning, and if public has an understanding as to what they see. You read the typical zoning code, you don't really know what you're going to get. A concise, organized zoning code that reflects the diversity of a district can actually do that better. You can document it through establishing kind of how those different form districts work and making clearer, more graphical standards to establish how building forms work in different places. And you can administer it in different ways. Somerville, we've done this strategy citywide, but some communities just focus on their commercial center or the neighborhoods around their commercial center that need a bit more development, that really lend themselves well to a Missing Middle housing type, or a special development district where you can kind of break the rules of the old style subdivisions and do something a bit different. And I will make sure everybody gets all these slides. There's a lot of words here. Major public review you do up front. You can add like special exemptions, special permits and stuff, but if the community's culture will allow it, it's often easier to make some of these missing middle types by right in the certain districts after you work through the codes. They're used all over the country. People, this is actually a pretty old list. There's a lot longer list of places that have done this. This is also an old list of some communities in New England that have used form-based codes in different areas. And that has allowed the capacity to be able to be more creative with how you can talk to a community and how you can open up the possibility of missing middle housing. If it works well, as city people say, it shortens the review time and gives developers a better idea of what a community requires. If your city or town wants to be more clear, that's helpful from a government perspective. From the developers and their funders, it provides consistency with how neighboring properties are improved. One of the things I really like about a form-based code, particularly one that's done with real community conversation, is it does break some of the political divisions we focus on sometimes. This quote from a newspaper about this: "We can't tell if this code is a radical green left-wing document or a developer-friendly market-based right-wing one." So maybe it's both, I don't know. But if it achieves the goals of providing new housing opportunities, it seems to be a pretty valuable opportunity. So Somerville, we've done this. Mind you, we started with a more intense development pattern to begin with, so that part's a little bit easier, but we also start with a very active community that has a lot to say on this front. And that means that there's a lot of kind of conversation. So our code took way longer to get done than I would have wanted, but nonetheless, it was finished in 2019. It really does make sure to establish the missing middle types. And I want to show in 3 zones kind of how we did the missing middle types for Somerville, and just say that form-based codes are contextual and can be adapted to the context of the place where they're located. And it can make a lot of sense to kind of push and pull and see it can fit in a more rural location. It can fit in a neighborhood downtown. In our case, the best example of looking at how this works is taking a corridor like Somerville's Broadway corridor in their Winter Hill neighborhood and look at how the neighborhoods in the back are neighborhood residents. That's a district that I'll dig deeper into in a minute, but it allows 1, 2, and 3 family houses, depending upon how much land you have. The urban residents is kind of more on the corridors and in places where there's been more intense activity or could be more intense activity. That allows the fourplex, the apartment building and some other types that are more flexible. And then the purples, the MRs, those are the mixed use districts. Those are ones that allow you to introduce retail and office buildings into the mix as well. So the NR zone is a 2-family plus zone. We placed a description of one of the building types we call detached house, which is basically a 2-family house. In Somerville's code, it's laid out over a 2-page spread and 4 sections on lot standards, building placement, massing, and use, and you can kind of look straight across and get a basic idea immediately of what you can and can't do here. Somerville's code also allows you to add certain building components like dormers and front porches and rear additions, and you can package that all together. In this district, you can add a 3rd unit under some pretty strict circumstances, but basically for the most part, it's a two-family district. The urban residence, like I said, is really designed for the more traditional apartment building. It kind of goes from the triple decker to the apartment house, the apartment building. Here, the semi-detached triple decker, the idea here is this is 6 units sort of put together. A very typical design for our neighborhood. Again, you can adopt these to designs that are typical to any given community. This is the row house type, which is kind of traditional row house, not with big parking lots in front. The apartment house, which is an apartment that's made to look more like a traditional house. So it can look like a big house and operate like a big house from the outside, but on the inside, it's really 4, 6 units of housing. Multiplex, and then the kind of bigger apartment buildings. And each of those have the 2-page spreads to describe the nature of how they can be done. And then the mixed use districts go by height. We have a 3-story district, a 4-story district, and each of them have, I think we go 5 and 6, and each of them have examples of different buildings. This is the general mixed use building in a mid-rise 4-story district, shows how to create a 4-story building. This can go more residential, it can have 1st floor retail, but generally you have some flexibility on use, but you end up typically with a unit type that allows for something that's in between the single family and the really big. we still have use tables. There's no Turkish baths list here, but it's a pretty simple, straightforward use table. You'll notice that we ended up with the SP, which is the special permit in the mixed use districts when you do residential, but they're permitted by right in the first two districts. That's the world of political compromise. I probably would have liked to have had all of them be by right, but it's one of those conversations you have about fitting things with your community character. And just to mention and kind of wrap up on this, there's other conversations that tie into the discussion about missing middle. In Somerville's code, we have regulations on requiring inclusionary affordable housing as part of these because we do have housing displacement challenges. We have extensive rules on mobility management, trying to reduce parking spaces because we're trying to reduce the amount of driving in cars and get more people to look at public transit and alternatives. We also have a robust public transit system where we are. Some communities have more or less of that, but I would say that reducing parking does provide more opportunities to build housing that's more affordable to more people. And certainly reducing the need to put 2, 3, 4 parking spaces per unit and sort of spread pavement all over the place makes for a better design missing middle housing too. And then we have rules on sustainable development and green buildings. Mainly that applies to the larger buildings, but we're always focused on the idea that not just are we addressing housing issues, but at the same time, we're also trying to address climate change issues and trying to address the concerns the community has about being an environmentally sustainable place. So all of those package together and integrate and work well in the code. But at the end of the day, what those districts, particularly the urban residents and districts like it, are intended to do is to make sure that we can produce missing middle housing, do it in a way that's contextual, do it in a way that the community is supportive of, and do it in a way that allows for the opportunity to make it a part of our overall community's mix. And I think for different communities and different circumstances, the New England context is different from rural to urban. There are opportunities to kind of find that housing type and build a code system that works for it and with it. So I will stop there. I'm happy to answer questions at the time that's appropriate, but thank you all for your time today.
Thank you, George. That was wonderful. You provided some great information packed into that short amount of time. And before I introduce our second speaker, I want to remind everyone to please submit your questions via the Q&A box, not in the chat box. We'd love to answer the speakers would love to answer some of your questions at the end of this session. So our next speaker is Heather Shank. Heather has been the city planner for the city of Concord since 2016. She worked in the public sector for the past 7 years and was a private consultant for a landscape architecture and planning firm for 5 years prior to that. Heather is currently focused on a major overhaul of the City of Concord zoning ordinance, which is undergoing an update to a hybrid form-based code. Some of the objectives for the new code include bringing existing lots into compliance with dimensional standards, improving flexibility and options for homeowners desiring to make improvements or add additional units, reducing the need for variances, and encouraging new housing types. Heather, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jody. That was an excellent presentation by George to lead into what I'm going to talk about. That was all a foundation and conversations that we had a few years ago when council approved the funds to do this hybrid form-based code. We talked about all that stuff, and I gave a number of presentations to try to explain some of those concepts so that council and the community understood what we were doing and why we were doing it. And you'll see many of those concepts reflected in this presentation. I'm focusing specifically on some major changes that we made in the code to promote some of the missing middle objectives that we're talking about today. So just to give you a little bit of background of what the overall objective of the form-based code document was before I zoom in on some of the literal changes that were made to promote housing. It was to create a clear and user-friendly document, something that was easier to read and had the graphics. We really liked the appeal of the graphics to help explain what we were looking for. Our old code was patchwork together, very confusing. You had to look in multiple places for things, and it was a challenge for anyone except the zoning administrator to understand. We wanted to reduce the need for variances. I'll talk about that a little. Oh, wait, hold on. I forgot to share my screen. Hold on. This will make it so much easier for you. Wait a sec. Okay. Are you seeing my screen? I hope.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. There we go. Yes, so the overall project goals were to create the user-friendly document, reduce the need for variances, which I'll talk about more later, provide more housing options, provide standards to implement the City of Villages concept that is described in our master plan. The master plan, we have several decades of master plans that describe Concord as a city of villages, but there in certain locations there really weren't standards to explain how to accomplish that, or how to maintain existing patterns or promote the existing traditional patterns that were there. And also to maintain existing neighborhood character and open space resources. So essentially, don't change anything. So we were trying to change everything without changing anything. We didn't want to change the character or the appearance or the aesthetic of the city, and we certainly weren't looking to expand the urban growth boundary or change how Concord has an extensive network of open space resources and conservation land and trails, and we weren't interested in moving into those areas. It was really about redevelopment, infill, opportunities within the urban growth boundary. So some of the goals related to the housing options, enhancing the housing options, were to match zoning to existing patterns, offer greater flexibility in unit allocation, reduce parking standards, and code for new housing types. So you may see some parallels with what George was just talking about. And I'm going to go into each one of those. But what you're seeing here on the right is one of our newest kind of more what do I want to say? One of our newest developments that is progressive, that sort of encompassed a lot of these ideas. This is a cottage development, and it was on the site of an old church that was slated to be demolished. This is a very small site. It's 1.5 acres, and he has 10 units on there. They're attached. You can't tell if they're attached, but they're attached in the back through the garages. This is a central green, which also functions if there's an emergency. It's the emergency access because there is no real road. All of the roads are alleys through the back, which has very limited access, as you can imagine. This is on State Street in downtown Concord, so it's a very dense area. And he needed, for this project, let me just step back a bit, I think something like 20-something variances. So part of the goal of the code was to make something like this possible without so many variances. He still might have needed a few, but certainly not 20-something. So matching zoning to existing patterns. We had our consultants do an analysis of downtown Concord, and what you're seeing here on the right is an analysis of the conformity, the compliance with the zoning standards for frontage and area. So all of the parcels here that you're seeing that are white, those are the parcels that complied with the frontage, with the lot size. The parcels in pink are the parcels that would comply if we changed the lot frontage to a certain size. The parcels in this mauve color is how much would, the mauve, the pink, and the white would be conforming if we made it even smaller. And those parcels in the burnt umber are what would be conforming if we made it even. So in this district, this is the downtown residential district, I think. So the parcels in the mauve color was 4,000 square foot lot area, and 7,500 is the existing. So the ones in white comply with the 7,500, and the ones in the mauve or in the dark brick color are 4,000. So these were some of the analysis that we did to determine how we should change the dimensional standards to bring more lots into compliance, to basically right size the zoning. On the bottom is the frontage analysis. So everything in white complies with the 75-foot frontage, and then on down to the dark brown color, which is 45. So our goal with changing the dimensional standards was to make them as small as possible without promoting lot splits of an average size lot. So if you had a double size lot, which you would go down the street and sort of recognize, oh, they have a double lot, those were the lots that we were targeting to be able to subdivide, because under the current code, that was so restrictive and all the lots were so out of compliance that almost nobody could put another unit in there, even if they clearly had space. So that was one facet of that. We also provided matching existing zoning patterns to provide flexibility for side yard setbacks. So in many cases, a lot of the variances were if somebody wanted to do an addition consistent with their existing house, but it's in the side yard. So they would have to get a variance for this just to match what their existing condition was in terms of the location of their building. So there are various provisions that address that. The main one that affects all the lots is that instead of saying, all right, you have 10 feet on this side and 10 feet on this side that are required, so 20, we changed that to a total. So instead of having 10 and 10, you're required to have, and we made them a little bit smaller, 19 total. So you need a minimum of 5 on whichever side, and then the remainder on the other side. So you could have 14 on one side, 5 on the other, 7 and 13 or whatever. So as long as you had a minimum of 5 and you totaled 20 or 19 or whatever the setback was, you had that flexibility. So that was really important for just regular property owners, because regular property owners were our main target. We wanted regular people to be able to do things with their houses that were really consistent with the character of the neighborhood, but was just really cumbersome, and there were a lot of obstacles to it with the way that the code was written. So allow front porches or stoops to encroach in the front yard. So if you had, consistent with all of the other houses in the neighborhood, if you wanted to put a porch on your house or build a house with the porch, there's a certain amount that you would be allowed by right to encroach in that front yard setback just for that stoop or that front porch. And that was a way of encouraging people to make those improvements or construct that way. We also eliminated buffers for neighborhood multifamily. Our code was written such that standards for multifamily, you might think of the standard suburban apartment complexes. All of the standards for multifamily made a lot of sense for those types of suburban complexes, but the problem is they also applied to any multifamily in the downtown Concord area. So if you just wanted to do, if you had a huge house and you want to change it from a single unit to a 3 unit, you would have to provide a 25-foot buffer all the way around your property, even though nothing aesthetically really is changing about your property. So we eliminated those buffers within the downtown districts for multifamily. And that's just, we also eliminated, for instance, the requirement that you have 1.5 times the lot size, 1.5 times the frontage. I'll talk about that more in a minute as well. But here's just an analysis that I showed council before they had allocated the funds. This square here, these are the same neighborhood. This is 14 lots, and this is 6. So I showed council, if this block complied with the setback requirements, you could see here the degree of nonconformity on every single lot. Just about every single lot does not conform with the setback requirements. If all of the lots, if they complied, every single house would be non-conforming. Same for this block. If every single block, so the blue outline is the setback requirement. If every single lot complied with the setback, this is what it would look like. And you could see every single house also does not comply, except for this one, which has a garage in the backyard, which would comply because I think it meets the 5-foot setback. So then I showed them, if they all complied with the lot and area and frontage requirements, like 100% complied, this is what each of those blocks would look like. So this block would go, and this, by the way, is a sort of very attractive, beloved neighborhood. Like if you went to council and said, would you like this neighborhood to be demolished and reconstructed in this way? No one would say yes. That would be like horrifying. So here you have 14 units, 14 houses, 14 lots, down to 8. 8 is how many you could fit on that block if you complied with the zoning. This one would go from 6 to 4. So this was extremely compelling, extremely striking to council. They were just like, holy crap, our zoning is broken, which it was. So this is the problem that we're trying to fix. So the second point, greater flexibility in unit allocation. This is the hugest piece. This is definitely the hugest piece. So we no longer have single family districts. And this is something we started years ago, like 3 or 4 years ago, we came up with this concept that instead of saying, here's our single family district, here's our duplex district, here's our 3, here's our 4, whatever, we now have units allocated based on frontage. And the purpose of this was to provide, more and more people were coming saying, we want to do a mother-in-law, we want to do an ADU. And this was before the state changed their laws to say everywhere you allow single family has to have an ADU. So we set like a base assumption, depending on the district, that every single lot should, if they comply with the new dimensional standards, should be able to have at least 2 units, if not 3. So a duplex with an ADU or some other mother-in-law unit. And in some areas that went down to 1 plus an ADU, but still, it's still a huge change from what the code was before. So there's still a density, it's still related to density. So in the R10 district, which is the larger 10,000 square foot lots, you might get 1 unit per 50 feet of frontage. So the base, if you comply, you would have 100 feet of frontage. A regular lot might have 100 feet of frontage. And so they would get 2 units on that lot. In the closer in residential districts, you know, the more dense neighborhoods, the lot frontage might have changed down to 60 from 80. And in those districts, if you would get 1 unit per like 15 or 20 feet of frontage. I'm just making these up because I can't remember them. So automatically in the residential district, if you had 60 feet of frontage, you would get 4 units. If you had 80 feet of frontage, meaning you would comply with the previous code, you would get you know, even more units. So essentially it was sort of set up to right size the districts and give everyone who complied at least 2, if not 3 units. And then for those that had extra, they would even get more units. And this was a way to promote people using, you know, doing flexible things on their property, doing infill development. So let's see, did I catch every points here? Eliminate additional frontage, yeah. So again, instead of saying, okay, the requirement is 80 feet for a single family in the downtown residential district, and then by the way, if you want to do a duplex, it's 120. Now we're saying, well, if you have 80 feet of frontage, you can have 4 units, perhaps. We also created design standards as a way to mitigate, you know, bad things from happening. So for instance, now we have design standards where every house has to have a front door component facing the street. So you need a porch or a stoop or something on the street. Garages have to be either detached behind or set at least 6 feet back, which is what made more sense for some of the more suburban neighborhoods, because these standards apply everywhere, the entire city in all the districts. Sorry if I'm going too fast. So here again is what the code is, what it looks like. Again, this is proposed, so this is not adopted yet, but we have this page here, sample unit configurations, to demonstrate to people, hey, if you're allowed 3 units, this is, you know, this is what you might do. You might put a unit, let's see, I can't see on my screen, it's too small, but you might put a unit in the back of your house, you might put a unit over a garage, you might do a detached unit, the way this one is back here. You could actually even do 4 cottage units, the way the previous project did. They could be separate buildings. Another aspect of this, which I didn't touch on, is that the density is allocated by frontage, but also by livable area. So if you were allowed 4 units, each of those units is allowed a livable area of, well, we've gone back and forth between 750 and 900. I think we're going to end up going with 900. But what that means, for instance, if you've got a 30,000 square foot house and you're allowed 4 units, well, let's go back to the 750 for this example. It's just easier to explain. You can't add any additions on your lot if you want to do multifamily. If you've got a 3,000 square foot house, livable area house, and you're allowed 4 units, you can't build anymore. You can put units in your house, but you can't change the density on that site. If you've got a 1,500 square foot house and you're allowed 4 units or 3,000 square feet, you could do a duplex behind your existing house, or you could build onto your house. So you can sort of, what this graphic is sort of showing is that you can mix and match how your livable area and your units match up. And it gives you a ton of flexibility with how you can do that. And again, this is all by right. Not saying you don't have to go through the site plan review process for some things. Okay, I have a 2-minute warning. And this is just an example of how the code is looking. So you can see we have these graphic components, and we're giving some examples of the types of housing that we're looking for. This one, again, we tried to address the parking issue. We went about this in a lot of different ways, and as you can imagine, it was very contentious and a lot of disagreeing opinions. But what we've come down to is that instead of requiring 2 spaces for every single unit, that we will require 1.5 spaces for multifamily and low income or age restricted. So we have reduced the parking requirements. We eliminated parking requirements for several districts in the dense urban downtown area. We now allow stacked spaces if it's just 2 spaces, which we did not before. And we also allow off-site parking with some type of deed restriction. So this code for new housing types is one of the 3rd things that we did. And this really relates more to the phase 2 of the project. Phase 1 will pertain to all of the existing areas of the city. And phase 2 pertains to like more suburban areas that don't have a vision or there's no existing infrastructure. So some of the commercial strips, the malls, places like that where they're in need of redevelopment. So some of the ideas that we put in there, the green is frontage. This is actually phase 1. So going back to that first graphic of the cottage houses, in the new code, if that green is a certain size, that can count towards your frontage in terms of unit allocation. So how many units you can fit around that green is dependent on the size of that green. So that was a way to promote that cottage pocket neighborhood development where there's no street frontage. New mixed use districts, we transitioned several districts into mixed use districts, and we coded for those that exist, and we'll code for new ones that don't exist yet. We made a lot of changes in the code recently, just like piecemeal, because developers are coming in wanting to do housing. And so this was a plan that I worked on with someone, with a developer who I'm not sure it's ever going to get constructed, but they did get approved for it. And what you're seeing here is actually a T&D development. So the fronts of these units are the central green. The fronts of these units are the street. The fronts of these units are Pembroke Road. And the fronts of these units are infill in this existing single family neighborhood. And then the parking is all accessed through the back. And of course, we got multifamily fronting on the townhomes. And then we've got a little component here, commercial component here. So this was a really exciting project, and the architects did a great job of demonstrating the type of development that it was intended to be. And again, the new housing types are exactly what George was mentioning: the detached, the fourplex, compact, urban, triplex, duplex, just trying to promote those in some of these areas that have traditionally really been single family neighborhoods. I know that was a lot, but we do have a website. We've got a number of documents on it. I didn't add it on here, but yeah, that's what I got for you. I apologize. I could go on for another 2 hours.
Thank you, Heather. That was fantastic. So we got some questions rolling in the Q&A box. So we're gonna roll right into that. So the first question I'm gonna throw at you, George. So allowing for missing middle housing doesn't necessarily guarantee the housing will be affordable. And we'd be interested in your strategies to preserve housing affordability. Without specific strategies in any new affordable housing will become unaffordable over time. Would you please be able to speak to that?
Sure, and thanks. That's a great question. And affordable housing is always a complex part of this. Somerville has had an inclusionary housing ordinance since the 1990s, where we require a percentage of units to be affordable in larger projects. And actually, we now have that requirement set at 20%. So if somebody builds one of those podium buildings with 4 stories of wood stick built building over a concrete base and builds 500 units, I get 20% of those as affordable housing units for people at 50 or 80% of area median income. And that's really helpful. One of the challenges, I think, that we still have challenges with calibrating is how to bring inclusionary housing and missing middle together without putting our own city subsidies into it. Without getting too deep into this, we had that number at 17.5% of units once you did more than 7. I think my advice to most people is, if you want to create affordable out of inclusionary out of missing middle housing, you have to really start to understand the economics of where that internal inclusionary housing subsidy does or doesn't work. It might not work at 1 unit out of a 4-plex. You're usually dealing with smaller local developers, not the bigger production developers, when you're dealing with these middle housing types. And I think there's a balance in being able to say, okay, we want some of those units to be affordable. At the same time, we want to make sure that they actually are buildable. So my advice is, if you can use inclusionary as a tool, as long as you make sure you're not using it as a tool to make housing unbuildable because it doesn't work. The other available tool is really looking at housing trusts and housing finance that's available. And I don't know the ins and outs of how that works in different states. We do collect a linkage fee off commercial developers and some other things. So we have a pool of money that's available for affordable housing. We have a nonprofit community development corporation. One of the things that oftentimes a nonprofit like that can actually build missing middle housing, and that's an opportunity for them to build an all affordable, ground up built 4-unit project. We're also creating a land trust in Somerville, similar to, I think Burlington, Vermont's got probably the best example of this in the country, where they've been able to stabilize affordable home ownership units in a variety of different housing types, and it fits well with the missing middle. If you look at the possibility of a land trust owning duplexes, fourplexes, and then selling them with restrictions and basically maintaining affordability that way. So there's a whole toolkit of affordability, and you have to fit it with missing middle and make sure that it's financially keeps the projects financially viable.
Thank you, George. Well said. This next question, Heather, I'm going to toss it at you. However, George, you might want to jump in towards the end of it as well. So we had a couple of questions come in, more than a couple of questions come in related to New Hampshire and having smaller communities in New Hampshire. You know, smaller communities lacking public sewer, water, transit, and a lot of the infrastructure that is typically needed in some of these, addressing some of these missing middle housing types. So Heather, how would you, let me read the question. Can you speak how you align the regulatory changes, form-based code, with public investment? Example, many New Hampshire communities lack the water sewer to support missing middle.
Yeah, so in Concord, that's actually kind of a relatively straightforward question, because for several decades, we've had the urban growth boundary. The urban growth boundary, so outside the urban growth boundary, there's no expectation that density will go there because there isn't infrastructure. The urban growth boundary was developed, I don't know, 10 or 20 years ago, and it is the extent to which it's desired or we are able in the city to support the extension of water and sewer. So we have a great capacity for sewer that is not maxed out, and the expectation is that a property owner, if they are within the urban growth boundary, it's actually not an expectation, it's in the code. If you're within the urban growth boundary, if you're within like 1,000 feet of the urban growth boundary, and you are required to connect to your property. So that's both an incentive for those people to build higher density if they're going to have to connect. And it's also a disincentive for them to put intensity there if they can't afford to connect. So we're not letting people just do subdivisions, sort of willy-nilly in those sort of outside those areas where we don't have infrastructure. Concord's not a great example because we have a pretty massive, extensive infrastructure. Some of it's aging, but it's there. So it's not so much a problem in Concord, but that was definitely a consideration. You know, these policies do not apply outside the growth the urban growth boundary. So one change that we did make was the minimum lot size in some of those districts was higher. We have an RO district, which is 2-acre district. It's going to stay the same. But then we've got a medium density district, which depending on whether you have sewer or not, the minimum is 43, an acre basically. And we changed that to say, hey, if DES will give you permission because of the soils to do a 30,000 square foot lot, if you can get permission from DES to do a smaller lot, then you're allowed to do that. So that was a way to promote efficient use of land without encountering the problems with the infrastructure.
Thank you, Heather. Appreciate that. George, did you want to add anything to that? I know Somerville might not have those struggles.
I have not had the opportunity in my 19 years of planning to work in a community that didn't have a sewer line running down every street. So it's a struggle for me a little bit. I would just simply add that this is a real challenge for missing middle, because with larger, you can do a significant enough development where you can try to build their own system. You can do the single families where everybody has their own septic. Once you get into that middle space, it really becomes more difficult. But it's probably worth looking if there are developers in the community that want to do that housing type and sort of figuring out what the strategies and the sizing and shapes are for being able to handle wastewater in those areas. And for a community that doesn't have a core, and you want to build one, is there a place, an intersection, a starting point where you can do something small that both can kind of pull together multiple people dealing with wastewater in that little area, while at the same time allowing an opportunity to provide more flexibility, density, and affordability of housing in that little core, and see if that's a starting point.
Yeah, the city of Concord also made investments in the infrastructure, and now we have sewer investment fees in certain areas where the infrastructure was built out by the city, so that in the future people will be paying off that investment as new development comes in. We also have impact fees, so that's one way that we look to the development community and the residential community to help fund the infrastructure.
Great. Thank you. I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. And this is a good one for both of you. George, I'll start with you, and then Heather, if you want to follow up. But were there any unanticipated needs, challenges that popped up during your planning process that other communities should consider proactively?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because our rezoning, we took on citywide rezoning, and it took 7 years. Which is, I'll be honest, consider carefully if you want to undertake that sort of a program and do that in a community with so many people with so many opinions to share and ideas and issues. There were two things that sort of evolved towards the end of this process, which got really challenging, or two or three. One of which was process, and really identifying which units and which circumstances still require that special permit or that trip to the planning board versus which ones you could do without it, or we have the in-between, which is site plan review, which basically you get a yes, it's an allowed, but you can put conditions on it, and under what circumstance we put what building type through what process. We're a very design-oriented community. We had spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. The idea that some of the apartment houses in the UR district can just be built by right is a pretty significant accomplishment and shift towards predictability for a community that had none before. But we got there, but in other districts, we didn't quite get as far. The mixed uses still all require the special permit for residential being in the mix. The affordability percentages are a real issue. We are testing a few things. So Somerville has extremely high housing prices right now, which does allow for a substantial amount of developer profit. It means that even some of the smaller folks can make good money off of smaller units and be able to subsidize inclusionary units. We brought the inclusionary requirement numbers down lower, or at least the city council did, than what our financial feasibility study suggests is doable. And we're monitoring that situation very carefully to make sure that we aren't making missing middle too difficult to build. And that's an inevitable part of these conversations. So if I need to build an affordable unit in a 5-unit building, some of the pre-2019 stuff didn't require that. But am I making it so much more difficult to build? At some point, I'm going to run out of people building those buildings. So we're keeping a really close eye on that and sort of looking to review and adjust on that front. I mean, I think the other challenge, and I think you saw it in a lot of Heather's conversations for us, is mapping. Just, what district with what intensity under what circumstances do you map where? And sometimes for some communities, if the form stuff, if you start in the multifamily in the downtown areas and kind of work your way out, you can focus more energy on that and not necessarily have to solve it in an entire community. But there was certainly a lot of discussion and adjustment about, well, what is this a space where we want mixed use? Is this a space where we want 4-story buildings? And kind of working through that was tricky.
I would say it might be premature for me to answer that question, because this is all proposed and hasn't gone. It's shortly in the next few months going to go for public review. And I've tried, boy, have I tried every step of the way to get feedback, to let people know. Concord tends to be a pretty progressive city, and they were ready for these types of changes. So every presentation I got was, that's excellent, that sounds great, go do it. And I kept saying, are you sure? Do you really understand what I'm saying here? And so really communicating to people what you're doing. It may be different in some of the smaller communities where you're getting that like instant backlash, but that just hasn't happened here, which is a little worrisome to me. I'm sort of like waiting for it to happen. But I would just say, I had to drag people to the table, the code office, engineering, fire, like I just had to drag people, legal. We were blessed with an amazing staff, but getting them all to the table and to think about what you're talking about and say, these are the changes. Is this a good idea? Was a real challenge for me, because everyone's, in their own silos. So really getting that coordination and making sure I met with every counselor individually to explain what I was doing. And of course, this was 4 years ago, and now I've got 5 new counselors that have no idea what I'm doing. So we'll see in a few months if I get, strung up somewhere, or if our code is on the way to being adopted, what maybe challenges I should have foreseen.
Thank you. I appreciate that response from both of you. And just to add to that, for some of the smaller communities that are on the session today that may not be aware of the resources that Plan New Hampshire offers, Plan New Hampshire offers technical assistance, the MTAG program, which is the Municipal Technical Assistance Grant Program. And that provides assistance to some of the smaller communities that lack that capacity that the question was referencing. And they also offer charrette programs. So it's a great tool. It's plannewhampshire.org for any of the smaller communities that are looking to consider adding more choices and places to live, but some of their zoning may be preventing it. That's a resource that they can check out. And with that, Sarah, I think I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, I just realized we're running very, very low on time. So I want to thank Heather and George for sharing your wisdom and your time with us. I want to thank Jody for leading us in this great discussion today. And I want to thank all of you for spending your lunch hour with us. Like I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar was recorded. We're going to send out the link. You can share it with your favorite planner or someone you think ought to watch it. And you can watch it again if you'd like. And we're going to send out the slides too, so you can read through those a little bit more slowly. So thank you again so much for joining us. And we'll hope you see you at the next webinar.
Thanks.